what do the functions call, bind, and apply do? Now that we know that the value of this is so unstable, it isn't determined by how the code is written on the page. It's not lexical. It's in fact determined by context, by how a function is executed. We can then look at ways to stabilize this so we can be more confident in what its value will be as we're coding up. In the previous question, I showed you a way in which we just, as we're developing, assign this to a variable. Sometimes it's called self, sometimes it's called VM, it doesn't matter. And that's one way in which we stabilize, we lock down a variable which points to, well, this, whatever you want this to be. So when asking this question, what do the functions call, bind, and apply do? These are just different ways in JavaScript of locking down, of stabilizing what the this keyword means when executing different functions. So how do we actually call a function? Now we can call a function by just typing the name of the function and adding in the braces at the end of it. So for the example on the page right now, I can call this function by just typing the name of the function and then the braces. And if it took parameters, I would add parameters within those braces. But that's one way of calling a function. But something to know about functions in JavaScript is that in JavaScript, functions are actually objects. Objects that have properties, and some of those properties are again functions. So let me show you. I'm just going to add a debug line here, and I'm going to start the debugger. And then let's watch A. So you can see A here. Although it's a function, you can actually see it seems to have some other properties associated with it. It's got this thing called a prototype and a proto, which we'll cover later on. But you can see also it's got these properties called arguments, caller, length, and name. And the name seems to be, well, the name of the function. Okay, so let me show you. But actually, let's see if we can, let me get rid of that breakpoint. Let's see if we can access those properties. If you've never done this before, it might be a bit confusing, but just follow along. And if you want, pause and write out some code yourself. But watch what I'm doing right now. I can type a.name. Let's bring the console up, clear that, and then let's run. And you can see here, on line 5, it's printing out A because A is the name of the function. Let's change the function name to asim, call asim.name, and there you can see now it's printing out asim. So it has some other properties as well. Let's give asim a parameter of, let's call it param1 and param2. And then let's put the debugger in there, and then let's run that again. And then let's watch asim. Get rid of the old one. And then let's look at that. So you can see now length is 2 because actually that's the number of arguments that the asim function can accept. Okay, so that's pretty interesting. What can we do with this? Well, there's a couple of things we can do. Let me resume execution. Now, if the function asim is an object, then theoretically I should be able to add properties onto this function. So let's see if we can do that. Okay, now let's move the breakpoint down to that line, and then let's debug again. Then let's look at asim, and there you can see our function asim has now got the property moo assigned to it. So not only can you look up existing properties, so name is an existing property on the asim function, but you can also add properties to functions as well. You can treat it really just like any other object. And just like other objects, it has functions as well. So in fact, we can do really interesting things like call toString on a function, and then when we print that out to the bottom of the page, we see in the console, let me Get some more space. You can see when we print asim2string, it actually prints out the content, the actual function asim, the actual text that makes up the function asim. So you can even grab the code that makes up the function. So what are some other properties, some other functions you can call on functions? So we can call the toString function on a function to actually get the text that can, the code of that function. But another function that we can run on a function is a function called call. Okay, let me get rid of those to clear up some space. And let me clear the console. So what asim.call does is actually just calls the function. So asim.call does, well, pretty much the same as just calling a function normally, as you'd normally do it with just the braces syntax. So both of those do essentially the same thing. So why might you use the .call function on the asim function instead of just using the standard parentheses syntax? Okay. Well, the main reason is actually the topic of this question, which is it's all about stabilizing the value of this. Okay. So this, in this context, is actually the global object. In fact, let me turn on use strict mode. Let's get rid of these parameters here. Clear the console. So now, if you remember, spend a second to just think, well, what do you expect of this to print out in this with the use strict mode? Okay, I'm going to run it now. Actually prints out undefined, and that's because in use strict mode, the default value of this is actually going to be the undefined object. What you can do by calling a function with the call function is actually you can pass in what you want this to be. So if I want this to be an empty object, that's what it's going to pass in. So if I now run that, and there you go. So now this, when calling asim and passing in an empty object, this in the function is actually the empty object that you passed in. Now it doesn't even have to be an object. You can pass in whatever you want as the first parameter. So if I want to pass in a number perhaps, let me clear the console and run that again. You can see that's actually what this points to. This now points to a number, the number 1. So if we wanted to use call, so moving back to our old example, our example from the what is the this keyword question. If you remember, we had an object called asim. In fact, I'm just going to copy and paste it. If you remember this example from the previous question, normally this value in the check other function was either going to be the global object, or if we're using use strict, was going to be undefined. By using call, so by calling check other, by using the call function and then passing in this on line 8, this, if you're calling asim, check this. Okay, let me go back to this point. So if we're calling asim.check this at the start of this function, this is the object asim. So when we call check other.call, we're passing in asim. And then this in the check other function is going to equal to asim. So let me just prove that to you by running this. So you can see now on line 7 is actually the asim object. So that's one of the reasons we use the function call, is to stabilize the value of this, is to define, is to be very explicit regarding what we want this to be in the function that we're calling. So now that you understand that actually functions are objects with other properties which can themselves be functions on the function object, the way to think about this parenthesis method of calling a function is that is equivalent to calling .call and passing in the caller, whatever it may be. If you don't have a caller, it will pass in non-use strict mode the window object, and in use strict mode it'll pass in nothing, so this will be undefined. So what other things can the call function do? Well, you can actually also pass it parameters, especially if the function you're calling takes parameters. So let me give you an example of that. Let me comment all of this out first though. Okay, I'm going to copy and paste some code on the screen. Okay. So we've got function A, which takes parameters B, C, and D. And inside there, I'm just logging this, then B, C, and D. So what you can do with call, so if I did a.call, the first parameter is going to be whatever I want this to be in the A function. And the other parameters are just going to be whatever parameters I want to pass to the A function. So if I do 1, 2, 3, 4, let's see what that prints out. And let me give myself some more room. And there you go. So on line 16, it's printing out 1 because the first parameter to the call function is whatever we want this to be in the function that we're calling. And the other parameters, 2, 3, and 4, are the parameters B, C, and D. So as we print them out, it's just printing out 1, 2, 3, and then 4. Okay, so that's the call function. What about the apply function? How is the apply function, how is it related to what we're talking about? Let me clear out the console and give myself some room. Now, it's quite easy to understand the apply function once you understand the call function. So the apply function is, again, it's another function that's available on functions. So we can actually do a.apply, okay? And I can then pass it again. The first parameter you pass to apply, very similar to call, is whatever value you want to pass as the this variable for the function that you're calling. But here it differs slightly. So instead of passing in any parameters as just parameters to call, you pass in any parameters as an array. So I want to do 2, 3, 4. Comment that one out. So both this method with apply and this method with call are equivalent. They should both print out the same thing. So let me show you. Let me go 1, 2, 3, and then 4. So that's it. That's apply. Apply is very, very similar to call. But then why are there two? Why might you use call versus why might you use apply? That's a good follow-on question I would ask if somebody answered both of these correctly. And the answer is pretty simple, really. Normally you would use call unless the function takes a variable number of parameters. So let me copy and paste some more code onto the screen. A sample that should hopefully explain what I'm talking about. So let's say I've got a function called sum, and with JavaScript you can pass a function a variable number of parameters, 1 to 10 parameters. It doesn't matter. You can pass a variable number of parameters without having to actually provide those parameters in the function definition. What happens is it gets passed in as an arguments array, which is available on all functions. All functions will have this arguments array. So what this sum functions does is that it takes any numbers that are passed to it via the arguments array and just sums it up and returns the total. So now if I did var x is equal to sum 1, 2, 3. So now let me clear the console and let's see what it prints out. So as you guess, it would print out 6. Now if you wanted to call this via the call function, you just do call and then perhaps null. We're not interested in this variable here. And then just call 1, 2, and 3. Then that should print out 6 again. And there you go, it prints out 6 again. So what would happen if instead of having a hard-coded list of numbers, we would just pass an array of something? So what if we just had var things, and that would equal to 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2... And we were just a variable list of numbers and we wouldn't know what they are. And we wanted to call the sum function. How would we actually do that? Well, we can't use the normal parenthesis method. We can't do sum and then pass in things because, well, this sum function doesn't take in an array. The only thing, we can't use sum.call because, again, you can't pass in things there because it won't make sense. Because all that would happen would be you're passing in one parameter, which is an array, rather than, how many is this, 10 parameters separately, one at a time. So what we can do is we can actually use the apply function. And again, we're going to pass in null for this, but then we can pass in every single parameter separately as an array, and then we can call that. And there we go. And that's how we would sum those up. So that's it. That's when you would use the apply function. It's when you want to call a function that takes a variadic, a variable number of parameters. Okay, so that's call and apply, and there's actually a third way of stabilizing the this keyword, the this variable, and that is via the bind function. So let me comment these out. And let me add some more code at the bottom. So if at the bottom here I was to write a function expression, so instead of writing function A, I type var A is equal to function, and it's an anonymous, well, this one I'm creating an anonymous function, and then let me just type console.log this, okay, and then I want to call A. So this should be undefined because we're using useStrict, and with useStrict, the default value of this is just going to be undefined. So what bind lets us do is at the time we define this function expression, I remember at the time we define the function expression, not at the time we call the function expression, but at the time we define the function expression, we can actually lock down what we want this to be. So we do that by, at the end of the curly braces, we can type .bind, and then whatever we pass to bind will be whatever it will use as this. So what I want to use is the number 1. And now anytime we call A anywhere else in our application, it will always be 1. Okay, even if we do something a bit different, even if we were to perhaps have var asim, and then asim has a property A which we make equal to A, or a property called func which we make equal to A. And if you remember, then if I'm typing asim.func, normally you'd expect the caller object to be used as a this value, but even in this scenario, because we're using bind, it's still, let me clear that console so it's clear, it's still going to be 1. You've locked it down. You've locked it down here exactly what you want this to be in this context by binding it to a value at the time you define the function. Now, one gotcha people have is they sometimes get confused because they're wondering why this doesn't work. So you can see it's actually showing me there's an error there already, and now if I try to run that, you can see it's going to give me the unexpected token dot, and that's because this bind function doesn't work when you're declaring a function like that. It only works with function expressions, so when you associate it with a variable, okay? And the reason that's happening is that this bind is a function that is applicable to the object that created, to the function object that is created. So what happens when you call this is this creates a function object and assigns it to the variable A. And then what we can do is a.bind 1. Okay, and then when we call A, oh sorry, so A is equal to a.bind 1. And then when we call, you see it's going to be 1. So all that we're doing when we're typing in .bind at the end here is we're just short-circuiting that extra line just to bind something directly to the function object that's created. Okay, so that's bind. So how might we use that in our example that we have in the previous lecture? Let me bring that back up to the top. So how might we use bind in this example to solve our problem of stabilizing this? Well, normally what you do is, let's just say here, well, you can see there's various methods we could use. So I can assign var check other to be a function, and then here I can just bind this and then just call check other. So at this point on line 7, okay, if you remember on line 7, this is the asim object on line 7. So we're binding the this on the check other function with the this outside the check other function, which is the asim object. So that's how we're stabilizing this in this context. How many times can I use this to explain this? Anyway, so let me run this one more time so you can see. And there you go. On line 6, the this keyword here, it has now been bound to the asim object explicitly by using the bind function. So now we've covered both the this keyword and how it can change depending on the execution context. We then talked about call, bind, and apply, and how we can use those functions to stabilize the value of this. And we've also touched upon a very, very important topic, which is that functions are in fact objects and they in fact derive from other objects, and specifically a function object, a base function object, which has the call, bind, and apply functions. And this leads on into the next couple of questions where we're going to start talking about object orientation in JavaScript